The room was packed, full of muffled laughter and the sounds of glasses clinking. Lights hung like twinkling stars above each table, reflecting off shiny surfaces, and the aroma of freshly served starters filled the room. It was a company gala dinner, one of those obligatory events where everything seemed designed to showcase perfect appearances and unrealistic achievements. But for me, that night would become the turning point of everything I knew. Beside me, she was flawless. Fitted dress, radiant smile, and the way he touched my hand seemed rehearsed, calculated, as if he knew exactly the impact he should have on the people around us. It was a show. And me, the blind protagonist who didn't understand the tragedy that was unfolding in real time, right under the spotlight. But the details, the signs. Oh, how it all made sense now. The constant lateness home, the messages she said were from work, that perfume that wasn't hers, but that always seemed to follow her. I knew. I always knew, but I chose to ignore it, until that moment. That's when I saw him. Him. Across the room, sitting at a table lit just enough for me to notice the way his eyes avoided mine, the way he kept his hands tight around the glass, squeezing it so tightly it looked like he was about to break it. Break it. He was there, as nervous as I was calm. Irony of fate, two men sharing an invisible stage, where only one could emerge victorious. But at that moment, I no longer wanted victory. I wanted justice. Every detail of the previous night came back like a flash in my mind. The message I sent her about dinner, the delay in the response, the hesitation disguised in vague words. Of course, I'll be there. I can't miss such a special night with you. The tone is sweet but distant, like someone trying to close a cycle without creating waves. And now, as I watched them exchange brief glances, full of hidden intentions, something inside me finally broke. I decided I wouldn't wait any longer. I raised my glass, knocking it lightly against the table, attracting the attention of those present. An awkward silence took over the place, and for a moment, I could almost hear the bated breaths around me. I felt her eyes fixed on me, scared, almost pleading, while he tried to keep his head down, as if it were possible to disappear among those present. But it wasn't possible. No more. I want to propose a toast, I began, my voice firm, but filled with something more, something that no one in that room could decipher yet. A toast to the truth. Because, after all, nothing else matters when it is revealed. The people around smiled, raised their glasses in an automatic movement, but the discomfort grew. The words echoed like a knife cutting through the room. No one knew exactly where this was going, but everyone felt like something big was about to happen. She opened her mouth, perhaps to try to control the chaos that was forming, but the interruption was immediate. No. Let me finish. You always had your chance to speak, now it's my turn, I cut in, looking straight into his eyes for the first time that night. It wasn't the eyes I loved. They were the eyes of someone who knew the mask was about to fall. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Everyone waited, frozen in their positions, as I advanced. I didn't beat around the bush. I told everything. Every detail of what I discovered, every message read in secret, every poorly rehearsed excuse. And as she spoke, it was impossible to ignore her expression changing, from shock to embarrassment, from shame to despair. He, on the other side, remained motionless, but his paleness conveyed the same fear. When I finally finished, the final blow came simply, directly, but devastatingly. And that's why, here, in front of all of you, I want to announce, this is the end. The end of marriage, of lies, of hypocrisy. I'm asking for a divorce. And, in case anyone is curious, her lover is sitting right there at that table, I pointed out without hesitation, and the buzz began. The reactions were instantaneous. Murmurs passed through the hall like a wave. People looked at each other, some covered their mouths with their hands, others tried to pretend they weren't watching the biggest scandal of the night. She stood frozen, like a statue that knew that no matter how much she wanted to move, the weight of the moment was too unbearable to allow it. But what struck me most was his look. The man who destroyed my marriage. He seemed small, insignificant, a ghost of his own arrogance. And in that moment, I realized that, as intense as my pain was, his shame was a weight that no man could bear to carry. I turned to leave, but not without leaving one last sentence. Something that would echo in everyone's mind for a long time: truth has a funny way of finding its way. And today, she found hers. I left the room, but the buzz behind me continued. The words spoken, the revelations made. What would come next? The consequences were just beginning. What would happen to her? With him? And, most importantly, with me? I knew this was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change not only my life, but also theirs, forever. Welcome to the channel where betrayal will never be glorified. Here, all the stories are fictional, created to reveal the devastation that betrayal brings to people's lives. Our goal is to show how choices have consequences and how the truth always finds its way. Get ready to dive into a shocking story, full of twists and intense emotions. Good listening, and remember, loyalty is the true pillar of any relationship. David and Laura's house was in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees that swayed in the wind, as if they wanted to protect the secrets that lived within those walls. It was a spacious house, with large windows that let sunlight invade the rooms and reveal the furniture carefully chosen by Laura over the years. Every corner of that home seemed to tell the story of a happy family. However, as with many stories, not everything was as it seemed. David was a dedicated man. At 39 years old, he had built a solid career as a financial manager at a prestigious company, which provided him with a comfortable life. He was known for his seriousness at work, but at home he was a man of simple and affectionate gestures. She loved cooking for her family, and whenever she could, she would prepare Laura's favorite dish, mushroom risotto. He liked to think that it was these small acts that kept the marriage strong, despite the adversities that arose over time. Laura, on the other hand, was more of a free spirit. At 36 years old, she was the type of woman who enchanted by her presence. Owner of classic beauty, but without ostentation, her true attraction was in the energy she transmitted. She was charismatic, outgoing, and had a unique ability to make anyone feel special in her company. Working in public relations at the same company as David, Laura was the smiling face everyone associated with efficiency and friendliness. She knew how to run events and make sure every detail was perfect. Perhaps it was this talent for creating impeccable sets that brought him so much professional success. Together for 12 years, David and Laura formed a couple admired by everyone. They seemed to have it all: a beautiful house, successful careers, and a relationship that, in the eyes of others, was synonymous with partnership. But the truth is, like any couple, they faced their own difficulties. Time seemed to have eroded some of the passion that existed at the beginning, replacing it with a comfortable but predictable routine. David noticed this in simple moments, like when Laura absent-mindedly answered his questions, or when conversations at the dinner table became more about work than shared dreams. Still, he believed this was the natural course of a long marriage. Phases, he said to himself. After all, it wasn't uncommon for the weight of daily responsibilities to erase some of the shine of yesteryear. It was this belief that kept him optimistic, convinced that simple gestures could rekindle what seemed dormant. Laura, on the other hand, felt restless. She was moved by novelty, by the sensation of something unexpected. And lately, his life seemed to revolve around commitments that repeated themselves like clockwork. The two had an active but very different social circle. While David preferred more intimate gatherings, with close friends and family, Laura loved grand events. Parties, dinners, and cocktails were his natural habitat. It was in these environments that she seemed to shine most intensely, as if there she found a version of herself that didn't fit within the walls of her home. David, in turn, felt out of place on such occasions, but he made an effort to accompany her, convinced that he was important to her. On this particular night, the company dinner was one such event. Laura once again looked radiant as she got ready, trying on dresses and jewelry. David watched her from the bedroom door, admired by the ease with which she transformed a trivial gesture into something captivating. He knew she had a knack for commanding attention, and while that delighted him, it also sometimes left him insecure. Not because he distrusted Laura, or at least he preferred to believe that, but because he didn't know if he was capable of keeping up with her brilliance. When they arrived at the event, the grandeur of the hall was impressive. Low lights created an elegant atmosphere, and the soft sound of a piano filled the room. Laura seemed in her element, greeting colleagues and spreading smiles. David, as usual, remained in the background, watching her with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. He knew these dinners were important to her, but there was always something about the looks she received, the prolonged conversations with specific people, that made him uncomfortable. However, he preferred to ignore these thoughts. Don't be paranoid, he told himself, convincing himself that it was all a result of his own insecurity. Laura had always been a captivating woman, and he knew that attracted attention. But at the same time, he felt like there was something more, something he couldn't fully identify. The dinner continued with toasts and speeches, while David tried to participate in the conversations around him. But his attention always returned to Laura, who was now at a nearby table, talking to some colleagues. His laugh was easy, and the sparkle in his eyes seemed more alive than ever. For a moment, David felt excluded, as if he were part of a different world than hers. Even so, he believed that night would end like all the others. They would return home, talk about the most memorable moments of dinner, and eventually Laura would lie down next to him, falling asleep peacefully. But what he didn't know was that night, something would happen that would forever change the way he viewed his marriage, his wife, and himself. Events were just beginning to unfold. The pieces were moving, each in its place, setting the stage for what came next. And in the midst of it all, David had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. Dinner continued at a pace that seemed to follow a carefully rehearsed choreography. Toasts were made, speeches were given, and laughter echoed throughout the room, filling the space with a warmth that contrasted with the cold David was beginning to feel internally. As he sat at his desk, politely interacting with his colleagues, he couldn't stop his eyes from roaming the crowd looking for Laura. It wasn't intentional, but a need he couldn't ignore. She was the gravitational center of his attention, even when he tried to focus on anything else. Laura was at another table, close by, but far enough away that David couldn't clearly hear the conversation. Her laugh flowed easily, and her face seemed to light up in a way he hadn't seen in a while. There was something about her that night that was different, but David struggled to understand what it was. He wanted to believe it was just Laura's natural glow, the one that always made her stand out anywhere, but a part of him, the one he insisted on ignoring, said there was something more. In a moment, he saw Laura leaning forward, whispering something to a man sitting next to her. The man looked comfortable, too relaxed for someone who should simply be attending a professional event. It was a familiarity that bothered David, but he tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just his own discomfort that made him see things where there was nothing. Even so, he couldn't stop a sense of distrust from creeping into his thoughts. David tried to become more involved in the conversations around him, but his mind was restless. Every time he looked at Laura, something inside him tightened. The way she gestured, the way she touched the shoulder of the man next to her, the way she smiled in a way that seemed too intimate for that context. He felt his heart beating faster, a mix of anxiety and something he didn't want to name. Was it jealousy? No, it couldn't be. He trusted Laura. Or at least that's what he repeated to himself, like a kind of mantra. When Laura got up from the table, David watched her as she crossed the room, looking as at ease as ever. She stopped to greet a few people along the way, her presence brightening each interaction. But there was something in her gaze that David had never noticed before. An almost imperceptible tension, as if she was trying to hide something. He knew he might be exaggerating, but something about that night felt out of place. And that was what bothered him most, uncertainty. It wasn't something concrete, just an intuition that refused to leave him alone. While watching Laura interact with other classmates, David was surprised by a conversation that brought him back to the present. A colleague mentioned something about changes in the company's management, about how some people were getting too close to each other to try to secure better positions. David responded mechanically, but his mind was miles away, always returning to Laura and that man. He needed an excuse, any excuse, to justify what he was feeling. Maybe it was just the pressure of work, or the fact that they weren't as connected as they used to be. When Laura returned to the table, her smile was intact, but David noticed something different. She avoided direct eye contact with him, which was unusual. He tried asking casual questions, something about how dinner was going, but her answers were curt, almost mechanical. It wasn't like her, and that made the feeling of discomfort increase. After dinner, when the lights started to dim and the music got louder, Laura suggested they stay a little longer. David, always the more reserved one, was reluctant but agreed, wanting to appear like an understanding husband. He knew how much those events meant to her, and he didn't want to be the one to ruin her fun. However, as she moved around the room, interacting with other colleagues, David felt like he was losing control of the situation. There was something happening, he could feel it, but he didn't know what it was. That's when he saw her again, this time in the corner of the room, with the same man. They were talking more privately, their heads tilted towards each other, as if sharing something that no one else could hear. David felt his stomach turn, a weight that seemed to constrict his breathing. He wanted to get up, go over there and confront them, but something held him back. Maybe it was the fear of being wrong, of making a scene for no reason. Or maybe it was the fear of being right, of everything he suspected turning out to be true. Laura seemed to be having fun, but her posture gave away something more. There was a nervousness in her gestures, a constant attention to her surroundings, as if she were aware that she was being watched. David decided he needed air. He left the room, heading to a nearby balcony, where the night breeze seemed to offer some relief. He lay there for a few minutes, trying to collect his thoughts, trying to convince himself that he was just imagining things. But the more he tried to calm down, the more the feeling of restlessness grew. When he returned, something was different. Laura was no longer where he had last seen her, and the man was also gone. David tried not to panic, but the emptiness at his desk was undeniable. He walked around the room, looking for her, trying to ignore the weight that seemed to gather in his chest. It was then that he saw her again, but this time, the world around him seemed to stop. Laura was in a distant hallway, with the man. They were close, closer than they should have been. And at that moment, David knew. There were no more doubts or uncertainties. The betrayal was there, before his eyes, raw and undeniable. He felt the ground disappear, as if everything he knew had been ripped from beneath his feet. But even in the midst of the pain, something began to form inside him. It wasn't just anger, it wasn't just sadness. It was something bigger, something he still couldn't name, but he knew it would be the force that would guide him in his next steps. He didn't make a scene, not then. Instead, he returned to the ballroom, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts and emotions. He knew this was just the beginning, that whatever happened next would change their lives forever. And as the music continued to play in the background, David felt like a new chapter was about to begin, one he had never imagined. The early morning silence was almost palpable when David finally turned the key in the front door. Each movement seemed loaded with a weight that he could barely support, but that drove him forward, an invisible force that guided him through the chaos within. The lights were off, except for the faint glow coming from the living room, where Laura was waiting for him. She was sitting on the sofa, her posture tense, her gaze fixed on something invisible. When he entered, the sound of the door echoed like thunder in the stillness, and she immediately stood up. Laura began speaking before he could even cross the threshold of the room, her voice filled with a mix of anxiety and desperation. She said she could explain, that nothing was as it seemed. But the words felt empty, echoing lifelessly in the space between them. David remained silent, his eyes fixed on her, a mix of pain and coldness that made her falter. He finally spoke, his voice low but carrying an intensity that made each word feel like a sharp blade. He said he didn't want empty explanations or rehearsed excuses. He wanted the truth, the whole truth. Laura hesitated, her eyes desperately searching for something in David's face that indicated compassion or understanding, but all she found was an insurmountable wall. She started to speak, stumbling over her words, trying to justify what had happened, but David interrupted her, his patience finally running out. "For how long?" he asked, his voice firm, almost a whisper, but with an intensity that made Laura flinch. She tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. He repeated the question, louder this time, pain brimming in his voice. Finally, she admitted it. It was months. Months of lies, hidden meetings, betrayals that slowly eroded what was left of their marriage. David listened to every word with an impenetrable expression, but inside, it was as if a tidal wave was destroying him. He asked about the man, about how it all started, but each answer felt like a stab, each detail ripped out a piece of his soul. Laura tried to justify it, saying that she felt alone, that she was looking for something that she could no longer find in marriage. But for David, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had chosen to lie, to cheat, instead of trying to make things right. When she finished, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. David got up and started pacing around the room, trying to process everything he had heard. He stopped suddenly, turning to Laura with an expression that mixed pain and determination. It was then that he said something that made her freeze. He knew more. He knew something she didn't imagine he had discovered. Laura tried to maintain her composure, but the way David was looking at her made her nervous. He began speaking again, this time with a calm that was even more frightening than his earlier anger. He told how, after suspecting betrayal, he began to observe, to connect the dots. But what he discovered was beyond what he expected. Laura's lover wasn't just any coworker. He was someone who had used his closeness to Laura to not only seduce her, but also to involve them both in something much bigger. David revealed that when he discreetly investigated, he discovered suspicious transactions at the company. Money being embezzled, contracts signed under dubious conditions. Everything led to the man Laura was involved with. And, indirectly, to her too. David knew that Laura was not an active part of the scheme, but her proximity to the man placed her at the center of a scandal that was about to explode. He had evidence, documents, everything he needed to take the case to the company's board of directors. And he knew that when that happened, the consequences would be devastating. Laura was in shock, her mind trying to process what she was hearing. She tried to deny it, but David interrupted, saying he wasn't interested in hearing any more lies. He handed her an envelope containing copies of the evidence, his expression cold as he talked about how this was not only a personal betrayal but also a matter of professional integrity. He said that, from that moment on, she would have to deal with the consequences of her choices, both in her marriage and in her career. The silence that followed was dense, filled with emotions that neither of them knew how to express. Laura tried to argue, but David simply took his keys and left, leaving her alone with the envelope and the weight of her choices. As he drove through the empty streets, his mind was filled with conflicting thoughts. He knew what he was doing was necessary, but that didn't make the pain any less. He felt betrayed, not just as a husband but also as a man, as someone who had blindly trusted someone else. Laura sat in the living room for hours, holding the envelope in her hands. She knew there was no going back, that the choices she made led her to that moment. But what she didn't know was how to deal with the consequences, how to face what came next. And as the night progressed, they both knew that this was just the beginning of something that would change their lives forever. David drove aimlessly, his hands tight on the steering wheel as the city passed him by in a blur of lights. The silence in the car was oppressive, interrupted only by the sound of the tires on the asphalt. He tried to organize his thoughts, but everything seemed chaotic. Laura's images, her confessions, her involvement with that man, and now the financial scandal in which she was, even indirectly, implicated. It was a lot to absorb. He wondered how it had slipped by for so long, how he hadn't noticed the more obvious signs. Or did he deliberately ignore them? I couldn't say more. When the car finally stopped, it was in an empty park, a place where he used to take Laura in the first years of their marriage. The contrast was cruel. He got out of the car, taking a deep breath of the cold early morning air, trying to find some clarity. Every step he took on the damp ground seemed to echo in the vastness of his thoughts. He sat down on one of the benches and put his hands over his face, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. He knew he couldn't just ignore what he discovered. There was a sense of justice that he couldn't suppress, but it meant putting Laura in a position that would completely destroy her. Meanwhile, Laura sat in the living room, the papers David had left spread out on the table in front of her. She had read and reread each document, and reality began to sink in like a constant blow to her chest. She knew that the man she was involved with was ambitious, that he would do anything to achieve what he wanted, but she never imagined that he was using his influence over her to cover up something so big. She felt manipulated, a piece in a bigger game she didn't even know she was playing. And now, through her own recklessness, she was linked to something that could ruin her life on all fronts. David returned home a few hours later. When he entered, he saw her exactly where he had left her, but she looked different. His posture was no longer that of someone trying to hide something, it was from someone who knew he was at a dead end. She looked up at him, and the look they exchanged was filled with conflicting emotions, guilt, anger, sadness, a mixture that neither of them could immediately put into words. "I didn't know," Laura said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I swear I didn't know what he was doing. I thought it was just." David interrupted, his voice firm but without the cold tone he had used before. "It doesn't matter what you thought anymore. What matters is what happened. And what happened was you chose someone like him. You chose to betray, to lie, and now we are here." Laura tried to get closer, but he instinctively backed away, creating a distance that seemed impossible to cross. "I made a mistake, David. A terrible mistake. But I can fix this. I want to fix this. I just need you to help me." David laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. It was a bitter, almost cruel sound. "Help you? Help you cover it up? Help you get out unscathed after everything? Laura, you don't understand. It's not just about you or me. It's about what's right. And what is certain is that he needs to be held accountable. And if that means you will be too, then so be it." She was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't try to wipe them away. "Do you still love me?" he asked, his voice shaking. David hesitated. It was a question he had been trying to avoid, a question he had no clear answer to. Finally, he responded, his voice low, almost imperceptible. "I don't know. After all this, I really don't know." That answer seemed to break something inside her. She fell back onto the couch, her shoulders shaking as she cried openly. David watched her, feeling a mixture of pity and exhaustion. He knew that, as much as he wanted to, he couldn't just erase what happened. There were wounds that could not be healed with words or tears. After a few minutes, she stood up, wiping her face. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice still fragile, but with a tone of determination. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Tomorrow, I'll take this to the board. They need to know. After that, I don't know. Maybe I need some time to think, to understand what I want from now on. But, Laura, I can't keep pretending that nothing happened." She nodded slowly, as if accepting what he was saying, but her eyes showed that something inside her was still fighting against that reality. "Okay," he finally said. "If that's what you need to do, I accept it. But please, David, don't give up on us yet." I know it's a lot to ask, but please don't give up. David didn't respond. He simply left the room, heading upstairs to the bedroom that now felt more like an emotional battlefield than a place of rest. He knew that what came next would be difficult, perhaps even unbearable, but he saw no other choice. The truth had to be faced, no matter the cost. And as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the only thing he could think about was how it all got to this point, and if he would ever be able to find peace again. The day dawned heavy, not because of the clouds in the sky, but because of the weight that seemed to hang over the house. The silence was oppressive, filled only by the muffled sound of the clock in the room. David came downstairs earlier than usual. The insomnia of the previous night had been relentless, and he preferred the discomfort of the action to the torture of lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. When he reached the kitchen, he found Laura already standing, holding a cup of coffee in both hands, as if the heat could somehow alleviate the cold she felt inside. She watched him enter, but neither of them spoke. It was as if every possible word had already been said, but none had managed to bridge the gap that had formed between them. David picked up a cup and poured coffee, keeping his eyes fixed on the slowly flowing liquid. There was no point in prolonging that silence, but he didn't know where to start. Laura finally broke the ice, her voice low, almost hesitant, but full of intention. She asked if he was really going to take the documents to the board that day. He nodded without looking up, his response dry and direct. Yes, he would do that. Not because I wanted to, but because I felt it was right. It was a question of principles, and these, despite everything, were still non-negotiable for him. Laura took a deep breath, trying to absorb the confirmation. She asked, almost in a whisper, what would happen to her after that. The question echoed in David's mind, but he didn't have a definitive answer. Everything felt uncertain, and he knew that anything he said at that moment would sound empty or forced. Instead, he just said that what happened would depend on the choices they both made from now on. Laura looked at him, searching for some sign of empathy, but found only a tired look, as if he was already carrying a burden too heavy to bear. When he left the house, Laura remained in the kitchen, looking at her coffee cup as if hoping to find answers deep in the china. The day she feared so much had arrived, and there was nothing more she could do to stop the events from unfolding. The choices he'd made over the past few months had paved the way to this moment, and now all that was left was to deal with the consequences. David arrived at the company with the determination of someone who knew he couldn't go back. He entered the building with firm steps, carrying the envelope with the evidence he had collected. It wasn't difficult to find the right people. The board was meeting in a conference room, and he asked to speak to them. When he entered, the executives' faces turned to him with a mixture of curiosity and surprise. David placed the envelope on the table and explained what he had discovered, his voice firm and controlled but filled with a tension he couldn't completely hide. As he detailed his findings, the atmosphere in the room became heavier. The directors' faces turned from surprise to incredulity, and then to absolute seriousness. They asked questions, some pointed, others hesitant, trying to understand the extent of the problem. David answered them all, knowing that every word he said was shaping the future of not only the company, but also Laura and himself. When he finished, there was a silence that seemed to last an eternity. Finally, the board president thanked him for his honesty and said they would take the case forward. It was clear that it wouldn't end there, but David knew he had done what he needed to do. As he left the conference room, he felt a mixture of relief and regret. He had fulfilled his moral obligation, but that did not lessen the emotional weight of the situation. He returned to his desk but couldn't concentrate on his work. His mind was full of questions and possibilities, none of them offering any kind of comfort. He knew that at some point he would have to face Laura again and decide what they would do with their marriage. But at that moment, he needed space, time to process everything that had happened. Meanwhile, Laura was at home, caught up in a whirlwind of emotions. She knew she couldn't just wait. I needed to act, but I didn't know where to start. The man she had been involved with had already sent messages that morning, trying to understand what was happening. She ignored them, unable to deal with him at that moment. She felt betrayed by him in a way she hadn't anticipated, as if he had used not only her trust but also her feelings to advance his own interests. It was a betrayal within a betrayal, and she didn't know how to deal with it. When David returned home that night, the tension between them was palpable. He entered without saying a word, and Laura was waiting for him in the living room, sitting on the same sofa where they had had so many meaningful conversations over the years. She called out to him, and he hesitated for a moment before sitting down in a nearby armchair. They stared at each other, silence once again filling the space between them. Laura began to speak, her voice shaky but firm. She said she had made a decision, that she no longer wanted to live with secrets or regrets. She was willing to face the consequences of what she had done, both in her marriage and in her company. He wanted to rebuild his life, even if it meant starting from scratch. David listened to her in silence, feeling a mixture of respect and sadness. He knew how much it cost her, but he also knew that none of it would erase what had happened. He finally spoke, his voice low but full of emotion. He said he was also trying to understand how to move forward, but that he needed time. Time to process, to heal, to decide if there was anything left between them worth saving. Laura nodded, understanding, but the pain on her face was evident. They had reached a point where words were insufficient, where only time could reveal what the future held for them. And so, that night, they both sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, trying to find some meaning in the chaos their lives had become. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and uncertainty, but they also knew that somehow they would need to find a way to move forward, no matter what that meant. The days that followed were a whirlwind for David and Laura, each dealing with their own demons in different ways. David immersed himself in his work, trying to find some kind of normalcy while the company's board of directors dealt with the implications of the evidence he presented. The investigation was swift and relentless. The man Laura was involved with was confronted directly and, under the pressure of evidence, admitted everything. Fraudulent contracts, embezzlement and a series of other irregularities came to light, leaving the company's reputation in tatters. For Laura, things also fell apart quickly. Although she was not directly involved in the schemes, her closeness to the man and the fact that she was in a relationship with him tarnished her image. Rumors spread like wildfire, and she found herself isolated, avoiding even her closest colleagues. She resigned before she was formally removed, knowing that it would be impossible to continue in that environment. Each day that passed felt like an unbearable weight, as if the air around him had grown thicker. She knew that the responsibility for her downfall lay not only with the man, but also with herself, for the choices she had made. David, in turn, was called to testify several times during the internal process and, eventually, as a witness in legal actions against the man. He felt like he was doing the right thing, but that didn't lessen the emptiness he felt. Laura's betrayal still weighed like an anchor, dragging him down even as he tried to move on. He asked himself several times if he would ever be able to forgive her, if it was possible to rebuild something after so much devastation. Over time, David began to open up to new possibilities. While visiting a company social event, he met Sophie, a lawyer hired to help the company deal with the legal issues that arose in the wake of the scandal. Sophie was different from Laura in many ways. There was a calm in her presence, a quiet strength that drew him to her. They started talking, first about work, then about more personal things. She also bore her scars, having gone through a difficult divorce a few years earlier. What started as a friendship soon evolved into something more, and David found in Sophie new hope, a chance to start over. Laura, on the other hand, decided she needed some time to herself. She left the house she lived in with David, moving to a small apartment in a distant neighborhood. Without a job, without the routine she knew, and with her reputation ruined, she found herself forced to confront who she had become. Laura began attending therapy sessions, something she had never considered before, and slowly began to understand the patterns that led her to make such destructive decisions. It wasn't a quick or easy process, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to face her flaws head-on. A few months later, Laura tried to contact David. They met at a cafe, a neutral place where she knew he would feel most comfortable. She apologized again, this time without trying to justify her actions, but simply taking responsibility for her mistakes. David listened, and although there was still a barrier between them, he realized that Laura was changed. He respected her for that, but made it clear that while he might forgive her one day, he didn't see a future for them as a couple. Laura accepted, knowing it was the least he could ask for after everything he had been through. Time passed, and they both went their separate ways. David and Sophie built a relationship based on trust and mutual respect, something he deeply valued after everything he had experienced. Laura, in turn, found a new career, working at a non-profit that helped women in difficult situations. She turned her pain and her mistakes into fuel to do something meaningful, something that would help her find redemption, if only for herself. Years later, during an unexpected encounter at a community event, David and Laura crossed paths again. There was no longer resentment between them, just a silent acceptance of what had been and what could never be. They exchanged polite words, wished each other the best, and went their separate ways. They both knew that the story they shared, as painful as it was, had shaped them in ways neither could have anticipated. And so, the story came to an end. Every choice, every action, every consequence led the characters to different places, but somehow, stronger and more aware of themselves. Betrayal destroyed what was before, but it also gave each person the opportunity to rebuild something new. It is a reminder that our actions have consequences, but also that forgiveness and a fresh start, although difficult, are possible. Now that you've heard this story, we want to hear from you. What did you think of the ending? How would you handle a situation like this? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Here, we believe that betrayal is never the answer and that every choice comes with a price. Thanks for watching and see you next time.